Hello traders. I looked at a lot of recent pumps in futures markets on FTX, and just like everyone basically in the market has been looking for, I was looking to try to see if there's a commonality between markets that pump and markets that don't. So what I looked at was I spent the last few days looking on FTX to see which futures markets have risen the most, and I found one factor that was pretty common between all of them. And if you've been following me for a bit, you probably know what I'm going to mention. It's been the aggregated funding rate. So what I've noticed is that, and this is probably the greatest example here, especially because YFII within Year in Finance, I mean, this has from, what is this, the 23rd of June to now, it's way more than doubled. It could even be like tripling, starting at 600 now, almost 1800. What's been the common pattern? Well, what I've seen a lot happen is after a sustained pump, a lot of traders think, okay, is this a very good time to use mean reversion to short it? Or is this a very good time to buy because we're going to get more carnage upward? A lot of the time when you see something like this happen, where the aggregated predicting funding rate becomes very, very negative, that basically means that a lot of futures traders are betting on the market falling a lot. Now, what tends to end up happening is when this funding rate gets very, very, very negative, typically price rises. Because I've found that especially with futures traders more than spot traders, price typically goes against their perception. So the exact moment where this actually did happen was about here when price was at resistance before it burst, a little bit higher. We see a massive change in funding, and I mean, unfortunately for a lot of people who were betting on the market falling, a lot of people started shorting, as you can see, betting on the market going lower. That the price actually never reached this point so far in the last few hours. Price never went back to that point of the flip. And for those who are curious, price went up about 50% after this extreme negativity. All right, case study number 2. This one not as clear because it's kind of all over the place, but I want to show it anyway because this coin recently just pumped a bunch on FTX futures as well. Kind of a similar pattern. The very second that people began to get negative, it actually accelerated the upward move. However, this one hasn't been the greatest, probably because there's not a lot of volume here. And not only is there not a lot of volume, it looks like this just hasn't really been a great pattern. But I did notice that, had you bought when this flipped and then just scalped it and shortly got out after, it would have been a pretty easy pump. But of course, no indicator is going to work all the time. But all this consistent negative funding probably wouldn't have been a terrible time to buy. But let's go on to a much better example, which is not YFII, but YFI. This is a different coin. It's still Year in Finance, though. So I really like this example because the same exact pattern happened. And actually, the inverse happened as well. Price began pumping, and then futures traders started buying the futures at a higher price than spot. That's why we had the funding rate to be very positive. And look what happened. When people got very optimistic right here, price just didn't really go up much more than like 2 or 3%, if that, and then it went down a little bit. But right here has been a just beautiful example of when to buy. Right before this pump, people started getting really bearish, crazily bearish. Right here, a lot of people selling futures right below spot. What happens? It pumps, and price doesn't even reach that point again so far. And it's just gotten more and more, people have been getting more and more negative, more and more bearish about this. And how has price responded to them? Going up. But now that this is happening, that does tell me that the market might have a higher likelihood of falling, because if more people are getting bullish, I mean, clearly that's going to probably make the market go lower, as markets do run. And AXS, Axis Infinity, this one had a very interesting pattern as well that look pretty similar, but again, these are all different times that this happened. So it wasn't just like all at one time when this pattern happened all the time. But price began rising, and essentially what happened was people just started selling the futures lower than spot. That's why funding was negative. And when, futures funding went a lot lower, and this is hourly funding, of course, although it is aggregated, but on FTX it's hourly. The very second that happened, it actually accelerated the upward move. right there. And what I've noticed the most, a pattern that I've really seen is when people start shorting in mass or selling their futures below spot, as can be seen here, a lot of times price doesn't really return to that point, which indicates to me a lot of trapped shorts. And I think that when the market rises to a point where it could be a market top, you would see funding not become positive, but become a lot less negative and maybe a little bit closer to zero/neutral, because that would indicate to me that a lot of those shorts are being forced to cover, are being liquidated, which creates a bunch of buying, which is going to probably put the futures price higher than the spot price, making funding green or neutral. So this one, yeah, definitely has been very interesting, but it's another one in which, had you just noticed the very second that price was rising, and then people got very, very scared and started selling futures below spot, I mean, this would have been a phenomenal time to buy. I think almost everyone would agree with me that had you bought here and prices here, this is a pretty good situation. And our final example, it's the same exact thing, same exact kind of pattern happening, except this one is extreme. If you look at just how much this is, that is a very large negative funding rate. Oh yeah. What ended up happening here is, as you can see, price began rising right here, which is, the first step in this kind of identifying what's going to pump. I like to do this when I see funding go very negative while price is rising. I just find it's better because then the upward momentum begins to incinerate the shorts and make them liquidated and make them cover their positions, and yeah, you get it. When this began to get very, very negative and got to kind of the peak right here, yeah, price pumps, as you can see right there. And this kind of pattern just has been happening, time and time again. However, I've noticed this pattern happen more with just random altcoins, not really Bitcoin, Ethereum, but random altcoins that just pump up, let's say 30%. And you're looking at this coin and you're like, hey, is this worth buying? If you begin to see the funding rate get very, very negative, indicating people are selling futures below spot, typically this has been a very reliable continuation of a pump rather than a full-on reversal historically. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. One, of course, is expectation versus reality, where a lot of people, expect the market will fall, and that's shown in the data. What ends up happening when people expect the market to fall? It will rise, and it will burn them. Another reason might be because of bots that are trying to chase negative funding. So what can end up happening is when funding is very negative, people are incentivized to buy because then they will earn the negative funding rate per hour, or on Binance Bybit for every 8 hours. So when funding gets negative enough, potentially there are bots that will either close their short positions or enter into long positions because they want to earn that funding, creating more buying pressure upward. And then couple that with the fact that, funding being very negative indicates that a lot of people are selling futures below spot. There could be a lot of trapped shorts that could get, kind of like I had said a few times already, that could get liquidated and become forced buyers at higher prices. So you can see that kind of pattern, happening there. However, this isn't always the case. As you can see here, this one just kind of came out of nowhere. Like really, I don't think that there's any way someone could have known that was going to happen unless you were in on it some way. But I think that a great sign was price continuing to rise. It looks very, very bullish. And you get here and you're like, okay, has price topped out? There's a lot of volatility to the upside. Have all the shorts been burned? When you see this much negative funding, I just can't help but to buy. And had you bought at 1,300, price is at least $200 higher than that. And at a peak recently, it was many more $100 more than that. But yeah, this is just a decently reliable indicator for altcoins that are, I'd say, large market caps or medium market caps. Smaller market caps like this, maybe not so much, but larger market caps like Yearn Finance, YFI, and YFII, and of course, AXS is a very large market cap. These ones have been pretty reliable and really good bottom signal right there. People get uber negative, although this kind of strategy deals more with price rising, then funding gets negative, then you buy, but still. But you can kind of see the reverse sometimes here, where it gets very positive at market tops because people get too bullish. And then you know what happens when people get too bullish. Market rises, same thing happened here. So yeah, I'd say that overall, someone asked me to review what do I think is the best way to identify pumps. And the answer to that question is, you're not going to be able to catch a pump at the beginning stage, and you shouldn't try to. That's going to be very difficult. You might need to, do some questionable things. But when the market's pumping already, that's when you can actually make an educated bet on whether the market will reverse or will continue rising. What I've noticed more often than not is that once a pump does happen on an altcoin, especially medium and larger cap, I've noticed that it continues to pump typically. Maybe that's just been a recent trend that markets have been trending more directionally and less choppy. They've just been more directional, and then here, instead of just like this. But I would say this is probably the best pump indicator that I know, where you notice a pump, you notice price rising on an altcoin, you see people getting very bearish, and then you get in either with a nice stop loss or with a planned exit if things go south. With that, happy trading. Keep an eye on the aggregated predicted funding rate whenever you see a market pumping, especially if it's a large market cap. And happy trading from there.